Hello everybody and welcome to Grey History, episode 86, Defeats and Dysfunction. Having concluded our focus on the show trials of 1793, it's time to rewind the clock and return to the Revolutionary War. With Belgium lost and enemies on every frontier, the summer of 1793 was anything but bright. In this episode on the War of the First Coalition, we will summarise the conflict to date. From its origins and its causes, we'll trace the struggle until Dumouriez's defection, the place where we last left the intricacies of the fight. From there, we'll jump back into it and examine the campaign of 1793, a campaign of French defeats and Allied dysfunction. That will set us up nicely for episode 87, Total War, where we'll witness the French revolutionaries transform the very nature of warfare and lay the foundations of modern-day conflicts. Yet, before we commence this grand campaign, a quick reminder that I need your help. It's only with the support of generous listeners that Grey History remains on the air. So, if you find the show entertaining, if you find it educational, then please do your part to keep Grey History going. With bonus content, ad-free listening, and a range of other perks, there's plenty to enjoy while doing your bit to make history that isn't black and white. Support the show today for a coffee or two a month at patreon.com. I look forward to welcoming you personally. It's with great pleasure that I get to welcome the newest citizen soldiers: Christian, Andrea, Albert, Seth, Martin, Mark, Fred, Albert, Robert, Anne, Paul, Bruce, and somebody else. Another warm welcome to the new True Revolutionary AR, and thank you to citizens Armin and Marcin, who have both increased their support and become True Revolutionaries. Speaking of promotions, thank you so much to Sophia for joining the fabulous Champions of the People. Finally, there's the great of the greats, the defenders of the Republic, the heroes of the Revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Of course, thank you to every member of the community, as this wouldn't be possible without you. Inevitable. That's how some historians see the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars. With Paris intent on remaking every aspect of the nation, a clash with the monarchies of Europe was simply a matter of time. Yet, while much ink has been spilled over the conflict's disputed inevitability, the probability of the war's eruption has never been my primary concern. For me, the fascinating conundrum is not the likelihood of conflict, but rather the probability that the French would win. After all, a brief examination of the situation in mid-1793 sees France in a seemingly hopeless position. When we last left the War of the First Coalition, France was besieged. On the frontiers, the armies of the Republic were at war with three of the great powers: Austria, Prussia, and England. Furthermore, in addition to waging war with the giants, the Kingdom of Spain, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and all but two of the large Italian states had also joined the fray. Surrounded on all sides by this vast alliance of adversaries, the French were alone. Moreover, the friendless Republic was crippled by division and dissent. Having been on the brink of bankruptcy for years, the nation was hardly ready for an all-consuming war. Supplies were insufficient, food was scarce, inflation was running unchecked. Perhaps worst of all, the nation was in a state of not one but two civil wars. Religious and social tensions had erupted in the Vendée, while the Republic's second, third and fourth largest cities declared themselves in armed insurrection against the capital. To top it off, military commanders had attempted multiple coups, while Republican and Royalist dissenters conspired with the enemy and assassinated elected deputies. Devoid of unity, desperate for supplies, and retreating on every front, the question I have always found fascinating is not the inevitability of the war, but instead the probability of French victory. With the crises facing the nation almost innumerable, how did the Republic survive? In fact, how did it thrive? Over the next few episodes, that is what we will find out. In order to trace France's embrace of so-called total war, we must rewind the clock to the origins of this bitter and bloody struggle. The roots of the conflict were planted in the summer of 1789. The first of these relates to the abolition of privileges, and the second concerns the émigrés. If we start with the former, the National Assembly decreed the abolition of the feudal system on the 4th of August 1789. In a frenzied late-night session, the deputies transformed society, jettisoning centuries of customs and traditions. However, as the revolution remade France in its entirety, it wasn't just the French who were impacted. On the eastern frontier, the German princes of the Holy Roman Empire were unexpected casualties. Germany, at this time, was not a single nation. Instead, the Holy Roman Empire was composed of hundreds of independent entities, from the larger states like Prussia and Bavaria to the free independent cities which you've probably never heard of. In the Rhineland alone, it's estimated that there were more than 100 distinct political entities prior to the revolution, some only a few square miles in area. Although by no means equal in size nor significance, a few of the more notable Rhinelandic entities did have direct interests in France. For example, the rulers of Speyer, Trier and Cologne possessed feudal domains and rights in Alsatian territory, and had done so for hundreds of years. Needless to say, the unilateral abolition of privileges war nicht so gut. Outraged by the unjust eradication of their property rights, the princes were seething at more than just loss of income. While feudalism's destruction might have been contained to France, for how long would this be the case? Many German regions had celebrated the revolution, and any replication in Germany would destroy not just feudalism, but the empire itself. It's here, with the hostility of princes on the rise, that we should return to the initial boogeyman of the revolution, the émigrés. Literally 2 days after the storming of the Bastille, Louis XVI's youngest brother, the Comte d'Artois, decided that he'd seen enough. Disgusted by the upstart assembly and its criminal revolution, Artois departed the nation on the 16th of July. Initially, the aristocrats who joined him were few in number, but ever so slowly, a trickle became a stream. The stream became a river. By the time war was openly discussed in 1791, thousands of French émigrés had gathered in the Rhineland. The most notable stronghold was that of the small German town of Koblenz, but émigré camps could be found across the frontier, with aristocratic officers forming armies to liberate the monarchy. The German princes had seemingly allied with the revolution's most dangerous foes. However, as tensions rose between Paris and the Rhineland, the diplomatic focus shifted southeast. Ultimately, the Klein Koblenz was irrelevant when compared to the power of Vienna. Led by Emperor Leopold II, the brother of the French Queen Marie Antoinette, Austria's actions, or lack thereof, would be critical for any potential conflict. Ironically, the French either misread or misunderstood most of Vienna's positions, with the latter having no interest in any revolutionary war. For years, Austria had been engaged in a largely fruitless conflict with the Ottoman Empire, while the Austrian Netherlands, aka modern-day Belgium, had just been reconquered after its failed revolution saw the briefly independent United States of Belgium. With no interest in destabilising his already precarious realm, the emperor hoped to maintain a policy of forceful but restrained neutrality. Unfortunately for Leopold, his actions consistently inflamed the French, who saw in his declarations further proof of leagues and conspiracies. As the diplomatic situation evolved towards hostilities, so too did French attitudes. Originally, the National Assembly had renounced conquests in May 1790. Repudiating war for the honour and glory of kings, the Assembly explicitly forbade the use of force against the liberty of other people. With its no conquest decree, defensive wars were still permitted, as were national wars waged for national interests. But the deputies were hostile to both naked aggression and troublesome alliances with foreign monarchs. Indeed, the Assembly's decree was an effort to maintain peace as Bourbon Spain threatened war with England during the so-called Nootka crisis of 1790. However, the attitudes of the revolutionaries shifted over time, particularly after the flight to Varennes. Defensive wars were entirely reasonable, and the nation was increasingly threatened by émigrés and foreign conspiracies. Come late 1791, the new Legislative Assembly changed the game. With experienced deputies barred from re-election and the King's Ministry, the Legislative Assembly elevated a fresh batch of inexperienced politicians. Sent into early retirement were many proponents of peace, while amongst the new representatives were crusaders for revolutionary war. The emergence of the Broussons, later known as the Girondins, was a critical development. Then, still members of the Jacobin Club, these Jacobin deputies were the dominant force of the Assembly. Fixated on the threat of the émigrés and their foreign supporters, Jacques Brousseau led the campaign for revolutionary war. Over the winter of 1791-92, the justifications changed substantially. At first, Brousseau proposed a defensive war. Tens of thousands of émigrés allegedly stalked the frontier, and their forced dispersal was of the utmost importance. Describing the émigré presence as a grave threat to the realm, the Jacobins were no less alarmed by their support from foreign powers. Before long, the merits of this defensive war had expanded. Soon, future Girondins were calling for a crusade for universal liberty, predicting an easy liberation of the enslaved peoples of Europe. Moreover, the increasing belligerence of foreign crowns had besmirched the nation's honour. As such, France must avenge its glory, despite such aristocratic notions having been previously renounced. For historians, these public justifications provide endless debate. So too do private sentiments. As leading Feuillants and the court moved in favour of war, many see hidden agendas. Yet, amongst this contagion of hysterical war fever, some were immune to the effects. As the Jacobin Club splintered on the issue, Robespierre warned famously that no one likes armed missionaries. The former deputy was ignored. The death of the Austrian Emperor Leopold II provided the final impetus for conflict. Succeeded by the combative Francis II, Austria was now ready to tango. With the French declaring war on the 20th of April 1792, the course of the revolution irrevocably changed. From the outset, it was clear this short and easy crusade was anything but. Simply put, the French army was a mess. Emigration had gutted the army's leadership, while mutinies and insubordination had crippled any discipline and effectiveness. Tensions existed between soldiers and volunteers, while supplies were as insufficient as the troops which desperately required them. With the revolutionary government having largely avoided significant reforms to the army, its deployment in the field proved as bankrupt as the monarchy which once led it. Faced with unexpected setbacks in this not-so-easy campaign, recriminations proved deadlier than bullets. Revolutionaries blamed the court, generals ignored their orders, the Girondins now looked incompetent, while the monarchs were seen as traitors. With everyone accusing everyone else of treason, the sans-culottes of Paris radicalised with haste. Equally speedy was counter-revolution. With Prussia entering the conflict to assist their Austrian allies, the invasion of France had begun. Threatened with historic destruction by the infamous Brunswick Manifesto, the people of Paris doubled down. Within 2 months, the monarchy was toppled, prisoners were massacred, and the convention had assembled to declare the French Republic. Among the chaos and convulsion, the French found unbelievable success. Led by the former Foreign Minister Dumouriez, the Republic was saved at Valmy in mid-September. The much mythologized battle was little more than a glorified skirmish, but its consequences were no less significant. Overnight, the Prussians were in full retreat, and the French were on the march. Before long, Belgium, the Rhineland, Savoy and Nice had all succumbed to France. With the removal of Louis XVI, seemingly the key to success, optimism returned to Paris. Soon, deputies spoke of sister republics in Poland and Naples, while the thrones of Europe allegedly had months to live. Interestingly, for a nation which had once proclaimed no conquests, annexations were on the agenda. Like the war itself, the issue divided the Jacobin club, although the Girondins had by now departed. For some Montagnards, any annexations should be treated with caution, if not outright refused. For others, it was the fulfilment of the nation's natural borders, a historic reclamation of the lands of ancient Gaul. In such circumstances, deputies clamoured for more. Soon, Savoy was annexed in late 1792, with Nice, Belgium and the Rhineland the following year. Curiously, reclaiming the Republic's rightful borders had never been an original cause for war. Yet, while the revolutionaries drank champagne to the success of the Republic, victory proved temporary. Across the frontiers, the retreating armies of the First Coalition were about to clean up their act. Well, sort of. As previously discussed, the First Coalition was completely dysfunctional. It was an alliance of adversaries, and by January 1793, cooperation between Austria and Prussia was ready to collapse. Both blamed each other for previous defeats, and Berlin was even threatening peace. Considering itself a mere accessory in the conflict, Prussia sought immediate compensation for past and future expenses. Without Prussian assistance, the Austrians had little chance of victory, or even reclaiming their lost territories in Belgium. As the Austrian Netherlands were the key to its desired Bavarian exchange, which would see them swapping the two territories to create a more unified Germanic realm, Vienna had to concede. With grave reluctance, it accepted the second partition of Poland. Satisfied by their territorial indemnities, Prussia would remain in the fight. However, while the First Coalition was anything but harmonious, the Grand Alliance was hardly impotent. With the French presence in Belgium soon bringing England and the Dutch Republic into the war, the coalition was bolstered again by Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and some of the Italian states. As we saw in Toulon, relations between England and Spain were equally fraught, with the nations having spent much of the previous century at war. Yet, at least temporarily, everyone could agree on one thing. They hated the Republic more. The expansion of the war wasn't the only issue now facing France in early 1793. Another critical problem was that of manpower. Prior to 1793, the French had conducted huge efforts to raise volunteer battalions. These units consisted not only of professional soldiers, but also National Guardsmen, and their preferable pay and command structures caused tensions between the volunteers and the regular troops. Critically, when these volunteers had enlisted, they had been signed up for one campaign. By the time Belgium was conquered in late 1792, the volunteers had done their duty. As such, while the nation's armies were already under strength, men went home. Witness accounts tell of the roads full of volunteers slowly drifting back to France. Technically, this was not desertion, although that and disease were also sapping strength. Naturally, the solution to this manpower conundrum was simply more recruitment, and in February 1793, the convention raised a levy of 300,000 troops. In some regions, this worked. In others, less so. By July 1793, only about 150,000 men had been raised, well short of the original target. Yet, as recruitment riots broke out in several departments, one region went rogue. With the Vendée erupting into outright rebellion, a royalist and Catholic army was soon marching in the nation's west. It was in these less than ideal circumstances that the empires striked back. At the start of March, Austria launched a blistering counterattack into Belgium, scattering French troops and halting Dumouriez's invasion of the Dutch Republic. Furthermore, the Prussians soon sprung across the Rhineland, besieging Mainz and forcing further retreats. Desperate to hold Belgium, Dumouriez was defeated on March 18 at the devastating Battle of Neerwinden. This defeat, combined with the growing hostility of the convention, to trigger his attempted coup just weeks later. Although the army of the north refused to march on Paris, the treason of yet another general sowed further suspicions of the officer class. Remember that, as it will become important once the show trials commence. It's here, having recapped our experiences of the war thus far, that we can examine subsequent events in detail. This includes not only the advance of Prussia and Austria, but also the renewed counteroffensives by the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. Furthermore, with Spain and England also entering the conflict, they too would launch their own invasions in addition to seizing Toulon. In the aftermath of Dumouriez's defection, Belgium was lost. Prior to his treason, Dumouriez had negotiated with the Austrian commander Coburg that the French would withdraw from both the Upper and Lower Netherlands. Despite the failure to march on Paris, this agreement was maintained, and in March and April 1793, French forces continued to pull back into France. Interestingly, this very gentlemanly agreement between the prince and the general fostered some kind-hearted sentiments from the Austrian camp. Consequently, Coburg shared the love. Following the footsteps of the Prussian commander Brunswick, a new manifesto was released as the Austrians prepared to invade. But if Brunswick had once threatened fire and fury, Coburg sang a different tune. Promising the French prosperity and glory, the prince praised the generous and beneficent intentions of General Dumouriez. Critically, he announced that his only object was to restore constitutional monarchy and to give both France and Europe peace, confidence, tranquility, and happiness. In a similar way that Hood would later promise the safe return of the French Mediterranean fleet, Coburg went on to announce that he would consider any surrendered fortifications as a sacred deposit, vowing to return them to the French monarchy. But despite these lovely words and generous promises, Coburg had misspoke. While waging the war was the prince's remit, concluding the peace was not. For his superiors in Vienna, the return of French fortresses which freely surrendered to the Austrians was simply unacceptable. To understand why, we must look to Antwerp. Days after the prince's proclamation, diplomats from England, Austria and Prussia met in Belgium in early April. The purpose of this meeting was for the Northern Allies to agree on a set of coherent war aims. Unfortunately for Coburg, their conclusion was the opposite of the commander's well-intended declaration. With the politicians in charge, the aims of the war changed dramatically. Gone was a focus on a quick and devastating victory. As the Republic was on the verge of collapse, now was the time for profit. Seeking to secure the spoils of war, each country began to focus on its own national priorities. Territorial annexations were firmly on the agenda, and an embarrassed Prince Coburg had to renounce his earlier program. A mere 4 days after his original manifesto, he clarified that his personal sentiments were only his individual views. Henceforth, a state of hostility between the emperor and the French nation was unhappily re-established. Yet, before Austria, Prussia, and England could seize their slice of the pie, there were victories to be won. Or, perhaps more accurately, sieges. If we start with the Belgian campaign of 1793, the border between France and Belgium was defined by an extensive array of fortifications. These forts had been built by the French engineer Vauban in the 1600s, and comprised a triple line of defence along much of the frontier. Consequently, if the Austrians and the English wished to march from Brussels to Paris, a significant number of these positions needed to be subdued. As such, the Anglo-Austrian armies focused on a variety of targets, most notably the frontier forts of Condé and Valenciennes. These fortified towns were only 5 miles apart and sat directly on the road between Brussels and Paris. Should they fall, the Allies would have a clear opening for an advance upon the capital. Additionally, although Prussian troops were in Belgium, the Duke of Brunswick and the bulk of his forces were stationed on the Rhine. In order to march back into eastern France, the key fortress of Mainz, just west of Frankfurt, needed to be reclaimed. Thus, priority number 1 in both northern theatres was dislodging the French from fortified positions. Only then could the Republic be devoured. Initially, one might be tempted to think that the sieges of Mainz, Condé and Valenciennes would be short affairs. In the Rhineland, the Prussian advance had forced the French to retreat, leaving an armed garrison of 20,000 men holding Mainz. True, 20,000 was a sizable force, but the French were isolated and ill-supplied. Consequently, they were wholly unprepared for a siege, and one might presume a quick Prussian victory. After all, this wasn't the French homeland, even if the convention had technically annexed approximately 80 Rhinelandic communities in March 1793. Likewise, on the frontier with Belgium, Condé and Valenciennes were hardly helms deep. French forces were still reeling from Dumouriez's defection, and issues of manpower and supplies were no less problematic. Moreover, history suggested that even these sieges would be brief. When the Prussians had invaded the previous summer, the fortresses of Longwy and Verdun had capitulated within days. Yet, for all the reasons suggesting easy triumphs, there was one critical problem. As the Allies prepared to besiege these crucial locations, the coalition armies were beset by a dangerous and invisible threat: complacency. A disease which saps both boldness and momentum. Allied commanders were convinced that victory was right around the corner. As such, time was not of the essence, and these sieges became protracted and tardy affairs. For example, the Anglo-Austrian forces in the Belgian theatre only encircled Valenciennes in late May. From there, the British proposed storming the fortifications, an act which, if successful, might have succeeded in early June. Instead, the Austrians overruled them and dictated a traditional siege. Thus, it wasn't until the end of July that Valenciennes was finally taken. Now, to be clear, Dumouriez's chaotic defection and the opportunities it presented had occurred at the end of March. 4 months later, the Allies had barely advanced. Yes, the frontier forts of Valenciennes and Condé had fallen, but remember, this was a series of strongholds with multiple lines of defences. In part because of multiple rivers in the area, nearby forts still needed to be taken. Worryingly, it was already the end of July. Winter was coming. The situation to the east was equally disappointing. Thanks to its military occupation of Poland, the Prussians had not deployed their full potential in the Rhineland. Consequently, while Mainz had been surrounded in mid-April, the French again held out until the end of July. According to the terms of surrender, the defenders were given safe passage to France, on the condition that they did not fight the Allies for a year. Fortunately for the troop-starved Republic, the terms said nothing about fighting domestic foes. So, while the spring had seen French forces retreating in disarray, a summer of complacency and caution had crippled the Allied advance. In slowly investing and besieging key fortifications, the coalition had granted the French the most precious of resources: time. Yet, as the French desperately got their act together, time was still required. For all the difficulties of March 1793, July was far worse. By July, the Federalist revolts had now commenced, and the Vendée rebels were scoring considerable success. The army's leadership was still in flux, while efforts to bolster recruitment, supplies and morale were proving painfully difficult. In Paris, no one could agree on tactics for the army of citizen soldiers, while the emerging Hébertists demanded the purge of all aristocratic officers. Perhaps worst of all, the fall of Mainz now exposed France to eastern invasion, while the loss of the northern frontier threatened a renewed Austrian advance. With the French devastated and divided, a concentrated assault could have been devastating. But it was not to be. To understand why the coalition failed to capitalise on the Republic's weakness in mid-1793, we must return to the geopolitical chessboard of 18th century Europe. With Austria, Prussia, and England fixated on their own bespoke interests, this alliance of adversaries would revert to its dysfunctional norms. If we start with the Rhineland, it's here that the formidable Prussian army returned to its predictable priority: Poland. Although the Duke of Brunswick had seized Mainz, and thus an invasion of Alsace was now possible, the Prussians did everything possible to sit on their hands. The reason for this was twofold. Firstly, the situation in Poland was precarious. True, the annexation had not been met with serious and sustained resistance, at least in the lands claimed by Prussia. But it was clear that the situation was unstable, and Polish aristocrats were proving a tad unmanageable. Consequently, the presence of both Prussian and Russian militaries were required. With Poland having always been Berlin's top priority, Brunswick was in no position to reassign troops from the east to the west. In fact, quite the opposite. King Frederick William II was redirecting soldiers from France to Poland, and then he departed the French frontier to tour his new Polish domains. And this underscores the second reason why the Prussians were enjoying a summer vacation on the Rhine. Although some historians consider the Revolutionary Wars inevitable and emphasize an ideological crusade of incompatible societies, ideology was never the foremost consideration of Berlin. Indeed, when push came to shove, the monarchies of Europe largely treated this war like any other, prioritizing annexations and indemnities over ideological considerations. Given this, the Prussians had little incentive to launch a new French campaign. From the Prussian perspective, further engagements would merely facilitate Austrian success. Be it the enlargement of their Belgian territories or the Bavarian exchange, neither development was in Berlin's self-interest. Furthermore, if Prussian troops did cross the Rhine with renewed and aggressive energy, what would be the reward? Why bother to seize Alsace or Lorraine unless those German-speaking regions were granted to Prussia? Berlin's original price for remaining in the war was Poland, a price that had already been paid. Unless Austria was willing to promise additional indemnities, why advance into France? With no temptation for a costly campaign, the Prussians came to a simple and logical conclusion: better to let Vienna exhaust its blood and treasure and extract further concessions in the future. So, if the Prussians were focused on their interests, what about the Austrians? Well, it's here that we should recap the fabled Bavarian exchange, as this overlooked policy shapes the decisions of Vienna, Berlin, and London. In the second half of the 18th century, Austria had a problem the size of Prussia. Under the famed leadership of Frederick the Great, the Prussians had outmaneuvered the Austrians on multiple occasions. Seizing the profitable region of Silesia during the War of Austrian Succession, Vienna's subsequent attempts to recover that lost territory failed miserably. Consequently, after the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Austria was on the hunt for new ways to reverse the ascension of Berlin. The result was the Bavarian Exchange. Simply put, Austria would exchange parts of Bavaria for parts of the Austrian Netherlands. This trade would greatly increase Austrian power in the German-speaking lands, create a more compact and secure realm, and finally rid Austria of its ties to the restless and distant Netherlands. While Belgium did produce sizable revenue for the Habsburgs, the Lower Netherlands were at times a considerable headache, one dispensable for a Central European monarch commanding Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. Bavaria, on the other hand, would do nicely. However, while enacting this Bavarian exchange had been a core objective for Austria, opposing it had been no less central for Prussia. Enabling a more unified, more Germanic Austria was hardly advantageous for a state with its own aspirations to lead Germany. It wasn't until the Austrians permitted the second partition of Poland, a division which they sat out of, that Berlin promised its assent. By March 1793, Austria had reclaimed Belgium, enabling a theoretical exchange at the end of hostilities. But that exchange was far from finalised, and thus the Austrians had an incentive to enlarge their Belgian territories with annexations from northern France. In seizing Vauban's French fortifications, the Austrians would turn them into the linchpin of Belgium's defence. Indeed, no comparable system existed on the Belgian side of the border, part of what had enabled Dumouriez's sweeping victories the autumn prior. The seizure of forts like Condé and Valenciennes would make Belgium more attractive and secure, both for Austria or for the Elector of Bavaria. Consequently, during the summer of 1793, the Austrians focused on siege warfare. Now, if one was being generous to this strategy, one would point out that Prince Coburg didn't have many alternatives, with the Prussians uncooperative and the British off on a marvellous adventure to Dunkirk. An advance on Paris was certainly a risky proposition. Absent Allied support, a cautious strategy of incremental sieges was a reasonable alternative. In fact, the pacified frontier would be a fantastic base of operations for 1794 and provide useful bargaining chips in any peace negotiations. However, this favourable interpretation does let Vienna off the hook. Yes, a coordinated coalition campaign, which could have been devastating, was crippled in no small part by the selfish designs of both Prussia and England. But we shouldn't pretend that Austria was the selfless and sensible player in an otherwise malfunctioning alliance. No, they too played their part. Cautious that Poland could be partitioned yet again, Austria also had troops in the east. These were to ward against Prussian and Russian opportunism, but such men might have made a difference in the west. Furthermore, Austrian troops were stationed elsewhere, including in northern Italy. You may recall, during the siege of Toulon, which did not commence until September, the Anglo-Spanish defence was desperate for Austrian soldiers from Milan. However, instead of selflessly helping their allies in desperate need of assistance, Vienna was keen to perform its own territorial shakedown of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. The result was protracted delays, and these troops contributing absolutely nothing to the siege at Toulon. In short, for all the problematic behaviour of its self-interested allies, Austria was hardly any better. It's here, with the self-centred priorities of Austria and Prussia, that we should turn our attention to Britain. To start with, it's worth reminding ourselves that England had only entered the war in February 1793, almost a year after the outbreak of hostilities between Paris and Vienna. London was late to the party. But this belated arrival was quite deliberate. Prime Minister Pitt had originally intended to remain neutral, and it was only the French victories of late 1792 that had changed his calculations. Given their desired non-involvement, the English were in no state to launch sizable operations in early 1793. In fact, London had actually been reducing the size of its army and navy until just months before. Consequently, it shouldn't be surprising that a nation planning for peace had little plans for military objectives once war was declared. Initially, The only thing that mattered was saving the Dutch Republic. The Dutch were a critical ally for the English, one vulnerable to French aggression. With the loss of the Netherlands a serious threat to England's supremacy in the Channel, inaction was unthinkable. However, the successful Austrian reclamation of Belgium in March 1793 had neutralised the French. As such, with the Allies gathering in Antwerp to discuss their collective war aims, London needed a plan. Or, perhaps more accurately, it needed one plan. The problem for the British government was that the cabinet was divided over what approach to take. In one camp, we find those who were strong proponents of a continued presence in the Low Countries. Given the small size of the British Army and the criticality of protecting the Dutch, some argued it was best for British forces to help the Austrians seize frontier fortifications. In this scenario, England would assist larger Austrian operations, except when it came to Dunkirk. For ministers in London, the French Channel port immediately opposite England's coastline was of crucial importance. Seen as a flexible bargaining chip, the English could keep this prized position as a gateway to the continent. Alternatively, they could hand it over to the Austrians, bulking out their holdings in Belgium and ensuring the port remained in friendly hands. Indeed, the potential transfer of Dunkirk to the Austrians relates to the broader vision of this strategy. Prior to the diplomatic revolution of 1756, Austria and England had been long-standing allies. It was only recently that the British and the Prussians had partnered together, and the British were questioning that decision. Separately, the Bavarian exchange was wholly unacceptable to London. Fearing that an independent Belgium would fall under French influence, England was determined to keep the Austrian Netherlands Austrian. Consequently, it was proposed that the two nations should resurrect their ancient ties, establish a new defensive alliance, and most importantly, keep an enlarged Belgium in Austrian hands. Given this proposal, supporting the Austrians along the Belgian frontier made a whole lot of sense. Seizing and annexing French border fortresses would permanently secure British interests by weakening France, strengthening Belgium, and keeping a continental great power as a protector of the Low Countries. Yet, for all the positive benefits of a campaign in Belgium, the proposal had its drawbacks. In 1793, England was experiencing considerable social unrest, while Parliament was by no means fully supportive of an extended continental war. Furthermore, for some in the ministry, the real prize was not Dunkirk, but opportunities elsewhere. First and foremost were the French colonies in the Caribbean, ripe for the picking thanks to slave rebellions and civil war. But Corsica was also vulnerable, a strategic base in the Mediterranean. Moreover, the French Channel ports were prone to raids, while the entire Mediterranean coast was exposed to a crippling blockade. These alternatives relied primarily on the navy, and were perhaps a better fit for utilising British strengths. To varying degrees, these options would cripple French commerce, assist continental allies, and permanently enrich England through territorial gains. Now, to be clear, what was not under consideration was the seizure of Toulon, as the Federalist revolts had not yet commenced. Likewise, supporting royalist dissidents was an option, but it would take time for the new civil war in the Vendée to become a viable option to support. So, torn between a Flanders campaign and operations in the Caribbean, the Channel and the Mediterranean, London decided all of the above. Initially, Belgium would be priority number one, but it was agreed that operations would soon be established in the Mediterranean before subsequently attacking French colonies across the Atlantic. Given this, after the fall of Condé and Valenciennes in July 1793, the British marched on Dunkirk. Critically, the Austrians were not supportive of this plan, and would much rather have had the English assist neutralising the more important positions which remained between Brussels and Paris. By comparison, Dunkirk seemed a relatively distant and unnecessary distraction, one wholly unnecessary from Vienna's point of view. However, London, and London alone, had decided that seizing Dunkirk was crucial for its national interests. As such, the small force of the Duke of York departed Coburg's army and marched on Dunkirk instead. It's here, with the Prussians on the Rhine, the Austrians on the frontier, and the British at Dunkirk, that we will leave the First Coalition and return to our focus on Paris. The reaction and reforms of the Republic would not only prove consequential, but they would redefine the very art of war. However, before we can get to the French embrace of so-called total war, I want to underline the point that in 1793, Austria, Prussia, and England were all separately pursuing their own self-interested priorities. Instead of acting together to finish off the Republic, the great powers were focused on their own individual concerns. Historians have condemned them ever since. For the French scholar and politician Adolphe Thiers, the coalition's decisions were catastrophic. Noting that the Allies acted without union, he chastised them for what he termed universal selfishness. To Thiers, the coalition was fixated on their own immediate profit. They were methodical and timid, attached to the traditional routines of war and politics, which the Republic would soon make obsolete. This rebuke by a French patriot is perhaps not surprising, but Thiers has good company. The English historian John Holland Rose is no less critical. Rose asks rhetorically if there was ever a more singular game of cross purposes. Each nation pursued their own interests, be it in Warsaw, Munich, or ports in the Channel and beyond. Rose concludes that despite all their protestations as to the need of re-establishing the French monarchy, they were all mainly bent on continuing the territorial scrambles of former years. As he notes succinctly, those two aims were utterly incompatible. Yet, to wrap up this episode, I think it's best we summarise these events with the acclaimed American scholar Robert Palmer. Palmer is no less severe in his conclusions, and he chides Prime Minister Pitt in particular for saving the French Republic. With the coalition having seized the frontier in late July, total victory was missed. It seemed that York and Coburg, ignoring the other forts in the line which they had pierced, would drive on with overwhelming forces towards their main objective, Paris. Arriving there in a few days, they could disperse the convention and annihilate the Committee of Public Safety. And since the country was already torn by anarchy and civil war, holding together only through the predominance of Paris, the Allies could then proceed to dictate such peace terms as they chose. The revolution might be quashed, and the Bourbons restored to a weakened and partitioned France. In that case, an era of relative peace might conceivably have followed. There might have been no Napoleon, and without Napoleon, all history since 1800 would undoubtedly have been different, not only in France, but even more significantly in Germany and Central Europe. As a matter of fact, to the amazement of the French, York and Coburg did nothing of the kind. The Duke of York was under orders from London to capture Dunkirk, which the English hoped to gain as a permanent base on the continent. The Duke therefore strained at the leash, replied to all of Coburg's remonstrances by citing his instructions, participated for a few days in minor actions near Valenciennes, and on August 12 marched his English Hanoverian and Hessian regiments to the sea. The Austrians, turning in the opposite direction, threatened Le Quesnoy and Maubeuge. Thus, the main Allied army broke in two, pursuing centrifugal lines, losing the strategic advantage of concentrated power. This gigantic blunder, which can be traced to William Pitt and the necessities of English politics, saved the French Republic from extinction. The Allied armies, it became clear, suffered as much as the French from internal discord, military incompetence, and political interference. The crowning irony is that, had York and Coburg combined in an attack on Paris, the English could probably have taken Dunkirk with the other spoils, whereas they lost it by being hasty and independent. Considering the summer campaign a gigantic blunder, historian Robert Palmer shares the criticism of his peers. Indeed, for many scholars, across both generational and national divides, the selfishness of the Allies is simply unjustifiable. Faced with a disorganised opponent, one crippled by division, the coalition perfected their dysfunctional union with greed and short-sightedness. In sparing the vulnerable Republic, this chain of unforced errors resulted not only in temporary setbacks, but ultimately humiliating defeats. Yet much of this episode has benefited from one thing: hindsight. Back in August 1793, the miscalculation of the Allies was hidden by menace. From the perspective of the French, this was their darkest hour. The British besieged Dunkirk. The Prussians prowled the Rhine. The Austrians had seized Vauban's fabled defences. To the south, Spain and Piedmont Sardinia posed their own counter-revolutionary threat, while the prized colonies in the Caribbean were beset by conflict and turmoil. Worse still, for all the external problems facing the troubled nation, the situation within France was somehow more terrifying. Toulon had defected with the entire Mediterranean fleet. Lyon and Bordeaux remained in federalist insurrection. Deputies were being assassinated, generals were proving treasonous, and the west of France was consumed in royalist insurgency. Assailed on every front, besieged from within and without, the glorious Republic was on the precipice of collapse. Only a revolution in the very nature of warfare could save the nation. Only total war. Thank you for listening to episode 86, Defeats and Dysfunction. If you have any questions on the War of the First Coalition, please send them in, as I will be doing a Q&A episode on the conflict. Early access to episode 87, Total War, is now available to all patrons on the True Revolutionary tier. If you're enjoying Grey History, please consider supporting the show today at patreon.com. For the price of just a coffee or two a month, you can enjoy the perks of helping to create history that isn't black and white. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the Revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Joining the fantastic heroes of the Revolution are the champions of the people: Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, and Sophia. As always, thank you to every member of the Grey History community.